All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are currently reading Angela Y. Davis's Women, Race, and Class. We are on Chapter 11, Rape, Racism, and the Myth of the Black Rapist, and we are on the middle of page 177. The experience of the Vietnam War furnished a further example of the extent to which racism could function as a provocation to rape. Because it was drummed into the heads of U.S. soldiers that they were fighting an inferior race, they could be taught that raping Vietnamese women was a necessary military duty. They could even be instructed to, quote, search, end quote, the women with their penises. It was the unwritten policy of the U.S. military command to systematically encourage rape, since it was an extremely effective weapon of mass terrorism. Where are the thousands upon thousands of Vietnam veterans who witnessed and participated in these horrors? To what extent did those brutal experiences affect their attitudes toward women in general? While it would be quite erroneous to single out Vietnam veterans as the main perpetrators of sexual crimes, there can be little doubt that the horrendous repercussions of the Vietnam experience are still being felt by all women in the United States today. It is a painful irony that some anti-rape theorists who ignore the part played by racism in instigating rape do not hesitate to argue that men of color are especially prone to commit sexual violence against women. In her very impressive study of rape, Susan Brown Miller claims that black men's historical oppression has placed many of the, quote, legitimate, end quote, expressions of male supremacy beyond their reach. They must resort, as a result, to acts of open sexual violence. In her portrayal of, quote, ghetto inhabitants, end quote, Brown Miller insists that, quote, corporate executive dining rooms and climb-ups Mount Everest are not usually accessible to those who form the subculture of violence. Access to a female body, through force, is within their ken. End quote. When Brown Miller's book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, was published, it was effusively praised in some circles. Time magazine, which selected her as one of its Women of the Year in 1976, described the book as, quote, the most rigorous and provocative piece of scholarship that has yet emerged from the feminist movement, end quote. In other circles, however, the book has been severely criticized for its part in the resuscitation of the old racist myth of the black rapist. It cannot be denied that Brown Miller's book is a pioneering scholarly contribution to the contemporary literature on rape. Yet many of her arguments are unfortunately pervaded with racist ideas. Characteristic of that perspective is her reinterpretation of the 1953 lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till. After this young boy had whistled at a white woman in Mississippi, his maimed body was found at the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. Quote, Till's action, end quote, said Brown Miller, quote, was more than a kid's brash prank, end quote. Quote, Emmett Till was going to show his black buddies that he, and by inference, they could get a white woman, and Carolyn Bryant was the nearest convenient object. In concrete terms, the accessibility of all white women was on review. And what of the wolf whistle? Till's gesture of adolescence bravado? The whistle was no small tweet of hubba hubba or melodious approval for a well-turned ankle. It was a deliberate insult just short of physical assault, a last reminder to Carolyn Bryant that this black boy, Till, had in mind to possess her, end quote. Yo, fuck this lady. This might be one of the most disgusting things I ever read in my life. When did she write this book? She wrote this in 1976. She a racist. I usually don't like to interject in the midst of reading, even when I disagree or when I have an issue with something that's being read. But this Brown Miller lady, Susan Brown Miller, this passage that was written about Emmett Till is disgusting. While Brown Miller deplores the sadistic punishment inflicted on Emmett Till, and it should also be pointed out, I'm not sure if this is going to be in here, but it should be pointed out that the woman who accused Emmett Till of whistling at her, in fact, recanted that statement and said that Emmett Till never whistled at her, that was not something that happened. So this whole thing that she wrote this all under a false pretense, which is something that has happened historically in America, is that a lie is some type of lie or deception comes from the from white America, white society. And because of the time that the lie or deception came out, it's something that's believed because of the amount of power that white people had in the society at a time when information was not as accessible, to put falsehoods out there and for those narratives to become deemed to be truth by people. Even black people would buy into some of these things. And as we have gotten further and further away from some of those times and closer, and we got deeper and deeper into the information age, a lot of these falsehoods and false narratives about black people and people of color has been disproven. A lot of these lynchings and murders and killings that were said to have been done because of rapes or rape accusations or sexual advances have been proven to be false, and that these things were just done out of hatred for black people. A lot of times done out of hatred for black people who were successful or black people who they deemed to be being uppity. Ida Wells was spoken about earlier in this book. Ida Wells has books and a lot of writings specifically on lynchings, which, has been covered in this book as well. But I just will point people towards that. While Brown Miller deplores the sadistic punishment inflicted on Emmett Till, the black youth emerges, nonetheless, as a guilty sexist, almost as guilty as his white racist murderers. After all, she argues, both Till and his murderers were exclusively concerned about their rights of possession over women. Unfortunately, Brown Miller is not the only contemporary writer on rape who has suffered the influence of racist ideology. According to Jean McKellar in her book, Rape, the Bait and the Trap, quote, blacks raised in the hard life of the ghetto learn that they can get what they want only by seizing it. Violence is the rule in the game for survival. Women are fair to prey. To obtain a woman, one subdues her, end quote. Matt Keller has been so completely mesmerized by racist propaganda that she makes the unabashed claim that 90% of all reported rapes in the United States are committed by black men. And as much as the FBI's corresponding figure is 47%, it is difficult to believe that Matt Keller's statement is not an intentional provocation. Most recent studies on rape in the United States have acknowledged the disparity between the actual incidents of sexual assaults and those which are reported to the police. According to Susan Brown Miller, for example, reported rapes range anywhere from 1 in 5 to 1 in 20. A study published by the New York Radical Feminist concluded that reported rapes run as low as 5%. Wow. In much of the contemporary literature on rape, there is nevertheless a tendency to equate the, quote, police blotter rapist, end quote, with the, quote, typical rapist, end quote. If this pattern persists, it will be practically impossible to uncover the real social causes of rape. Diana Russell's Politics of Rape unfortunately reinforces the current notion that the typical racist is a man of color, or, if he is white, a poor working class man. Subtitle, The Victim's Perspective, her book is based on a series of interviews with rape victims in San Francisco's Bay Area. Of the 22 cases she describes, 12, i.e., more than half, involve women who have been raped by black, Chicano, or Native American Indian men. It is revealing that only 26% of the original 95 interviews she conducted involved men of color. If this dubious process of selection is not enough to evoke deep suspicions of racism, consider the advice she offers to white women. Quote, if some black men see rape of white women as an act of revenge or as a justifiable expression of hostility toward whites, I think it is equally realistic for white women to be less trusting of black men than many of them are. End quote. I think one of the things I want to point out in reading this too is that this is just a reminder that hurt people, and a reminder that a lot of times when people are traumatized, they project that trauma out onto others, and rape is deplorable. Sexual violence, sexual assault is deplorable. The type of sexual violence that is normalized in this society that we live in this country and in the world in general is deplorable. However, it's also deplorable to take this deplorable act and to use it to espouse racist ideology, use it to espouse prejudicial ideology. I think that's all I'll say here. Brown, Miller, McKellar, and Russell are assuredly more subtle than earlier ideologues of racism, but their conclusions tragically beg comparison with the ideas of such scholarly apologists of racism as Winfield Collins, who published in 1918 a book entitled The Truth About Lynching in the Negro in the South, in which the author pleads that the South be made safe for the white race. Quote, "Two of the Negro's most prominent characteristics are the utter lack of chastity and complete ignorance of veracity. The Negro's sexual laxity, considered so immoral or even criminal in the white man's civilization, may have been all but a virtue in the habitat of his origin. There, nature developed in him intense sexual passions to offset his high death rate." End quote. Man, they was getting off some this. It's a sick thing to write. Collins resorts to pseudo-biological arguments, while Brown, Miller, Russell, and McKellar invoke environmental explanations. But in the final analysis, they all assert that black men are motivated in especially powerful ways to commit sexual violence against women. One of the earliest theoretical works associated with the contemporary feminist movement that dealt with the subject of rape and race was Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, the Case for Feminist Revolution. Racism in general, so Firestone claims, is actually an extension of sexism, invoking the biblical notion that, quote, "the races are no more than the various parents and siblings of the family of man," end quote. She develops a construct defining the white man as father, the white woman as wife and mother, the black people as the children. Transposing Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex into racial terms, Firestone implies that black men harbor an uncontrollable desire for sexual relations with white women. They want to kill the father and sleep with the mother. Moreover, in order to, quote, "be a man," end quote, the black man must, quote, "untie himself from his bond with the white female, relating to her, if at all, only in a degrading way. In addition, due to his virulent hatred and jealousy of her possessor, the white man, he may lust after her as a thing to be conquered in order to revenge himself on the white man," end quote. Like Brown, Miller, McKellar, and Russell, Firestone succumbs to the old racist sophistry of blaming the victim. Whether innocently or consciously, their pronouncements have facilitated the resurrection of the time-worn myth of the black rapist. Their historical myopia further prevents them from comprehending that the portrayal of black men as rapists reinforces racism's open invitation to white men to avail themselves sexually of black women's bodies. The fictional image of the black man as rapist has always strengthened its inseparable companion, the image of the black woman as chronically promiscuous. For once the notion is accepted that black men harbor irresistible and animal-like sexual urges, the entire race is invested with bestiality. If black men have their eyes on white women as sexual objects, then black women must certainly welcome the sexual attention of white men. Viewed as, quote, "loose women," end quote, and whores, black women's cries of rape would necessarily lack legitimacy. During the 1920s, a well-known Southern politician declared that there was no such thing as a, quote, "virtuous colored girl," end quote, over the age of 14. As it turns out, this white man had two families, one by his white wife and another by a black woman. Walter White, an outstanding anti-lynching leader and executive secretary of the NAACP, rightfully accused this man of, quote, "explaining and excusing his own moral derelictions by emphasizing the immorality of women of the inferior race," end quote. A contemporary black writer, Calvin Hurton, unfortunately succumbs to similar falsehoods about black women. In the study, Sex and Racism, he insists that, quote, "the Negro woman during slavery began to develop a deprecatory concept of herself, not only as a female, but as a human being as well," end quote. According to Herndon's analysis, quote, after the experiencing the ceaseless sexual immorality of the white South, end quote, the Negro woman became promiscuous and loose and could be had for the taking. Indeed, she came to look upon herself as the South viewed and treated her, for she had no other morality by which to shape her womanhood, end quote. Herndon's analysis never penetrates the ideological veil which has resulted in the minimizing of the sexual outrages constantly committed against black women. He falls into the trap of blaming the victim for the savage punishment she was historically forced to endure. And then that brings us to a stopping and within the chapter of that theme. And this is a longer chapter, which I find to be appropriate. All the chapters that there have been some shorter chapters and some longer chapters, and I believe this is one of because of the gravity of the issue, it's proper for it to be a longer chapter. It's also probably the most difficult chapter that I've read so far for me personally. And I think that one of the things that we pointed out that I take away from this most recent passage is the fact that when this false information, these false narratives get pushed out there, especially earlier on in the society or earlier on in this country when information was less accessible, that not only did white people buy into these tropes and buy into these prejudices and these lies, but black people began to buy into some of these things too. And this is the way that self-hatred manifests, and this is the way that communities and cultures become divided against themselves, is from these false narratives and these falsehoods being bought into the people that they are about, or being bought into by the people that they are about. So I'm going to end this segment, but I'm going to end this segment, but we'll be back. This episode will continue. I'm just going to take a moment to step away. Throughout the history of this country, black women have manifested a collective consciousness of their sexual victimization. They have also understood that they cannot adequately resist the sexual abuses they suffered without simultaneously attacking the fraudulent rape charges as a pretext for lynching. The reliance on rape as an instrument of white supremacist terror predates by several centuries the institution of lynching. During slavery, the lynching of black people did not occur extensively for the simple reason that slave owners were reluctant to destroy their valuable property. Flogging, yes, but lynching, no. Together with flogging, rape was a terribly efficient method of keeping black women and men alike in check. It was a routine arm of repression. Lynchings did occur before the Civil War, but they were aimed more often at white abolitionists who had no cash value on the market. According to William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, over 300 white people were lynched over the 2 decades following 1836. The incidence of lynchings climbed as the anti-slavery campaign gained in power and influence. Quote, as the slaveholders saw the fight going against them, despite their desperate struggle to check these forces, they more and more resorted to the rope. End quote. As Walter White concludes, quote, the lyncher entered upon the scene as a stalwart defender of the slave owners' profits, end quote. With the emancipation of the slaves, black people no longer possessed the market value for the former slaveholders and, quote, the lynching industry was revolutionized, end quote. When Ida B. Wells researched her first pamphlet against lynching, published in 1895 under the title A Red Record, she calculated that over 10,000 lynchings had taken place between 1865 and 1895. Quote, not all, nor nearly all of the murders done by white men during the past 30 years have come to light, but the statistics as gathered and preserved by white men, and which have not been questioned, show that during these years, more than 10,000 Negroes have been killed in cold blood without the formality of judicial trial and legal execution. And yet, as evidence of the absolute impunity with which the white man dares to kill a Negro, the same record shows that during all these years, and for all these murders, only 3 white men have been tried, convicted, and executed. As no white man has been lynched for the murder of colored people, These 3 executions are the only instances of the death penalty being visited upon white men for murdering Negroes." End quote. In connection with these lynchings and their countless barbarities, the myth of the black rapist was conjured up. It could only acquire its terrible powers of persuasion within the irrational world of racist ideology. However irrational the myth may be, it was not a spontaneous aberration. On the contrary, the myth of the black rapist was a distinctly political invention. As Frederick Douglass points out, black men were not indiscriminately labeled as rapists during slavery. Throughout the entire Civil War, in fact, not a single black man was publicly accused of raping a white woman. If black men possessed an animalistic urge to rape, argued Douglass, this alleged rape instinct would have certainly been activated when white women were left unprotected by their men who were fighting in the Confederate Army. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the menacing specter of the black rapist had not yet appeared on the historical scene, but lynchings, reserved during slavery for the white abolitionists, were proving to be a valuable political weapon. Before lynching could be consolidated as a popularly accepted institution, however, its savagery and its horrors had to be convincingly justified. These were the circumstances which spawned the myth of the black rapist, for the rape charge turned out to be the most powerful of several attempts to justify the lynching of black people. The institution of lynching, in turn, complemented by the continued rape of black women, became an essential ingredient of the post-war strategy of racist terror. In this way, the brutal exploitation of black labor was guaranteed, and after the betrayal of Reconstruction, the political domination of the black people as a whole was assured. During the first great wave of lynchings, propaganda urging the defense of white womanhood from black men's irrepressible rape instincts was conspicuous for its absence. As Frederick Douglass observed, the lawless killings of black people were most often described as a preventative measure to deter the black masses from rising up in revolt. At that time, the political function of mob murders was uncamouflaged. Lynching was undisguised counterinsurgency, a guarantee that black people would not be able to achieve their goals of citizenship and economic equality. Quote, "During this time," end quote, Douglass pointed out, quote, "the justification for the murder of Negroes was said to be Negro conspiracies, Negro insurrections, Negro schemes to murder all the white people, Negro plots to burn the town and to commit violence generally. But never a word was said or whispered about Negro outrages upon the white women and children," end quote. Later, when it became evident that these conspiracies, plots, and insurrections were fabrications that never materialized, the popular justification for lynching was modified. During the period following 1872, the years of the rise of such vigilant groups as the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia, a new pretext was concocted. Lynchings were represented as a necessary measure to prevent black supremacy over white people, in other words, to reaffirm white supremacy. After the betrayal of Reconstruction and the accompanying disenfranchisement of black people, the specter of black political supremacy as a pretext for lynching became outmoded. Still, as the post-war economic structure took shape, solidifying the super-exploitation of black labor, the number of lynchings continued to rise. This was the historical juncture when the cry of rape emerged as the major justification for lynching. Frederick Douglass's explanation of the political motives underlying the creation of the mythical black rapist is a brilliant analysis of the way ideology transforms to meet new historical conditions. Quote, "The times have changed, and the Negro's accusers have found it necessary to change with them. They have been compelled to invent a new charge to suit the times. The old charges are no longer valid. Upon them, the good opinion of the North and of mankind cannot be secured. Honest men no longer believe that there is any ground to apprehend Negro supremacy. Times and events have swept away these old refuges of lies. They were once powerful. They did their work in their day, and it did it with terrible energy and effect, but they are now cast aside as useless. The lie has lost its ability to deceive. The altered circumstances have made necessary a sterner, stronger, and more effective justification of Southern barbarism. And hence we have, according to my theory, to look into the face of a more shocking and blasting charge than either Negro supremacy or Negro insurrection," end quote. This more shocking and blasting charge, of course, was rape. Lynching was now explained and rationalized as the method to avenge black men's assaults on white Southern womanhood. As one apologist for lynching insisted, it was necessary to find, quote, a way of meeting the extraordinary condition with extraordinary means, hence lynching in order to hold in check the Negro in the South, end quote. I think that what stands out to me about that passage we just read there, multiple things. Every time I get done reading, there are always multiple things that stand out. But the first thing that stands out to me is when Frederick Douglass says that, or when Angela Davis says that, when Frederick Douglass says that the times have changed and the Negro's accusers have found it necessary to change with them. They have been compelled to invent a new charge to suit the times. The old charges are no longer valid. And that is the history politically and ideologically that exists in this country when it comes to the issue of race, when it comes specifically to the issue of race, when it has to do with black people and people that are descendants from African slaves that were here, is that as the times have passed, the racist ideology, the men at the head of the power structures and institutions that profit, produce, and perpetuate racist ideologies, they have altered their racist ideologies and shifted and changed their racist ideologies. It went from if we trace it all the way back to from indentured servitude and from trying to get indigenous people to be slaves to changing it to no indentured servitude and having only specifically black people being slaves and having them being slaves permanently, consolidating them to being considered property or 3/5 of human beings. And then as times changed and as the modernization set in, and as the world as a whole got rid of the slavery, and as the slavery that was specifically here in America was highlighted for its barbarism, slavery was eventually abolished. I think it's important to always point out when we speak about the abolishment of slavery, pointing out that Abraham Lincoln, the president who was credited for the Emancipation Proclamation and abolishing slavery, stated that if he could preserve the Union by keeping slavery, he would. If he could preserve the Union by getting rid of slavery, he would. And even that Emancipation Proclamation, the states that were part of the Union that still had slaves were permitted in that document to keep their slaves. And then you see as time passed and we get past Juneteenth and Galveston, Texas, and the last of slaves are free, you see that this racist ideology switched from them being 3/5 humans and being property to them being second-class citizens, to them being subhuman, and you see that the way that they, instead of having slaves, as it was pointed out here, they began to put the black codes and the black laws into action, and they began to have black people be arrested for not having a home or for not having a job, and then put them in prisons, making them part of chain gangs, and then they were essentially slaves again, working again in fields, and you see how sharecropping happened, and so I'm saying all these things, doing this sort of a quick review to show how as time passes the racist ideology changes. And the same thing, we haven't yet got there, but as you get to closer to the end of the middle and end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, you see how Jim Crow laws are now being put out in what we're reading here in the early 1920s, 1930s. But you see how those Jim Crow laws, when black people begin to fight against those things, and when the world begins to see the hypocrisy that America has by trying to preach democracy in all of these other nations and all of these other countries, invading these countries under the guise of democracy, and then they're not even having a democratic nation at home, they begin to adjust some of those things. So as the 50s and 60s and 70s come down, they get rid of the literacy tests that were stopping black people from voting, and get rid of these Jim Crow laws that were stopping black people from voting. But you see at that same time, the type of criminalization that is put upon black people. And so it changes from this property, subhuman, uncivilized type of connotation that black people have from this racist ideology that's being espoused, and it becomes this criminalization type of ideology that they are using. And you see how black people go from being talked about by politicians as being niggers or something or things of that sort, or about keeping slavery and not getting rid of slavery, to them preaching segregation and how they won't get rid of segregation, to them we get to past that time period, them talking about having super predators, or them talking about having welfare queens. And so you see how this racist ideology alters and shifts throughout time. And the reason that it is allowed to do that is because of the fact that it's not completely uprooted, because people aren't informed about the full spectrum, how our entire society is embedded with these things. And so I think that one of the things that I hope comes across from these Rockford Reading Dailies that we do, that I hope people get across, is just how deeply embedded our society is in racism, how deeply embedded our society is in misogyny and male supremacy, and how we have to, in class, and the type of classism that exists, and how it will take an effort to inform the masses of how deeply rooted these things are, and then an effort, once people have been informed about these things, to build ideology and build policy, procedures, organizations that can combat these things. And I think that in the process of doing that, we will educate ourselves on these things, and educate ourselves on how to absolve ourselves of these things. And so we're going to continue reading this chapter on the next episode. I believe we'll probably finish this chapter on the next episode. It's a longer chapter, so it might take 2 more episodes. But I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Rockford Reading Daily. Please share this on whatever platform that you're listening to it on. Be sure to listen to tomorrow's episode of Rockford Reading Daily. And we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity every day to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. All right.